If you haven't heard of the institution that calls itself Prager University, consider yourself in for something of a treat. You can visit Prager University at PragerU.com. You'll notice I said .com, not .edu. That's because Prager University isn't a university. It doesn't have any programs of study. It doesn't offer any undergrad or graduate degree courses. So, what is it?
Hi, I'm Dennis Prager. Prager University presents the most important ideas in free 5-minute videos on the internet.
Thank you, Dennis. So you're actually just a website that calls itself a university figuratively because you consider yourself to be educating people when you're really just giving your perspective on things that you consider to be important. I suppose that's all right. I mean, it doesn't make you much different than the average YouTuber, other than most vloggers not adopting a moniker that makes them sound like they have academic credentials. So, what are these important ideas that your university spreads?
We explain the ideas that have made America the freest and most prosperous society in history.
I'm sorry, freest and most prosperous? I'm going to link you to a PDF of the 2015 Human Freedom Index in the description box. Unlike you, it explains itself very well and how it calculates a ranking for the freest countries in the world. What was the number 1 spot of the 2015 report? Hong Kong, then Switzerland, Finland, and Denmark. The USA is number 20, so I hope you have some explanation for why a foundational principle of your university is so wrong. As for prosperous, I'm also going to link to you a website that tracks just how in debt the United States of America is. Most people with trillions of dollars in debt aren't prepared to call themselves prosperous, let alone boast about being the most prosperous, but that appears to be the Prager University way.
And we explain why only a free market system can lift a society from poverty, why the world so needs a strong American military, why Judeo-Christian values are the core of Western civilization, and much, much more.
Oh, so you produce videos with a conservative libertarian bias, huh? But what's this thing about lifting society from poverty using the free market? Our society doesn't have a truly free market, as the government has entire divisions, like the FDA, restricting the free market from unsafe and unethical practices. So are you suggesting that the countries that are impoverished need to adopt a system that you called the most prosperous country in the world doesn't use? Or are you suggesting that our country does need lifting from poverty through the free market, even though you just called it the most prosperous society in the world?
First, we feature some of the world's finest thinkers. Second, our videos are clear, concise, and entertaining.
Progressive versus progressive, competing to see who can most flamboyantly claim to be offended, to proclaim that their feelings have been hurt, or that their sensitivities have been rubbed raw, or their serenity disturbed, or their composure discombobulated.
All fight for you. So tired of these politicians.
You feature some of the world's finest thinkers, huh? Like a Washington Post columnist and Adam Carolla, a comedian. Sounds like a real think tank you've assembled over there at Prager U.
Being a normal boy is a serious liability in today's classroom.
Oh, speaking of think tanks, that lady actually does work for a conservative think tank, and her title is Resident Scholar. I know that some of your videos are by actual professors. Granted, you fish for those who hold your opinions and support your biases, but it's still better than people with credentials like that.
We employ sophisticated social media marketing to connect to our audience.
So now you're patting yourself on the back for using Facebook, Twitter, and Reddit and calling that sophisticated. I take back what I said earlier about you not being a real university. Harvard should take notes from you guys.
Our goal is to change minds, and just as important, to teach those who agree with our values how to make these arguments on their own so that they can also change minds.
That would be a reasonable ambition to have if the religious and political propaganda you were attempting to spread weren't mostly composed of bad ideas or things that are just plain wrong, like some of the things you've already said just in this video. Okay, the next part of your video just brags about how great you think that your website is because lots of people have watched some of your videos, but I have to include this clip.
Don't judge blacks differently. An argument for equality based on behavior and not skin color. delivered by a young black woman.
Holy shit, those credentials. You found yourself a certified young black woman who agrees with your perspective. Sign me up for that course, Professor.
70% of Americans use the internet as a regular source of news. This is especially true of young people, and 60% of our viewers are under 35 years old.
Yes, people do use the internet, especially young people. I'm not sure why you think that makes your perspective any more credible. Now, I was drawn to your videos by one in particular that demands a direct response. After watching it, I looked to see if I could find any of your videos that weren't mostly bullshit, but I couldn't find any out of the several that I watched. This subject is, of course, near and dear to my heart.
Why are America's public schools failing? Why, after more than a quarter century of perpetual reform, has the nation been unable to bring real change to public education?
Well, the American people's lack of priority for educational reform is a big reason. Excluding talks about taxes paying for public universities, education has barely been whispered about by the candidates from either of our major political parties during this current presidential campaign. Our current public education and reformation thereof simply hasn't been a major talking point for any of this year's candidates. The government itself hasn't been able to figure out that standardized testing is counterproductive and crippling the creativity and love of learning in young people, as well as accounting for extreme teacher stress and frustration. Also, wait, I suppose we should let the Stanford professor of political science answer the questions about America's public education. Why would you bother to listen to an actual public school teacher like me or a professor of, education? I think most of them may have not only a different but more accurate perspective that doesn't quite match your narrative.
At the heart of it lies the power of the teachers' unions.
Oh, of course, it's all those nasty, evil teachers' unions. It's not the actual governing body which makes decisions about education despite mostly having backgrounds in business law and politics. It's not the apathetic citizens, the underfunded, overworked, and underpaid teachers of this country trying to make up for massive scholastic deficits after many modern parents can't be bothered to teach their kids how to count or the alphabet, let alone read a damn book to them. It can't be that the current educational system was designed during the Industrial Revolution, and today's students are going to have to deal with more technology and distraction in their lives than any that have lived through the system before them. Oh no. The primary reason that America's public education system is struggling is those damn teachers' unions. Do go on.
Why has this happened? Partly it's because the teachers' unions are by far the most powerful groups in American education. More than that, they're special interest groups, which means that they use their power to promote the special interests, the job interests of their members. They're just not in the business of representing the interests of children, and no one should expect them to do that. The purpose of a union is to represent the job interests of its members, and these interests are simply not the same.
You just had the nerve to directly say that the interests of students are not in line with the interests of teachers. If you think teachers aren't prepared to make sacrifices for their students, then pay a visit to any public school in this country on a weekday around 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, sometimes later. Show up an hour before the first bell rings for class to begin. Stroll by on a Saturday. You'll find degree-holding professionals who could be making double or triple their salaries, who are working above and beyond their contracted hours because it's a joke to think that teachers can do all that's required of them in a 40-hour work week. Do bad teachers exist? Absolutely. And they're public enemy number one of the average and good teachers who make tremendous personal sacrifices because they're more interested in their students' futures than what many of their students or their parents are in their own futures. Oh, but do go on and tell us how the teachers' unions and teachers whose interests aren't aligned with those students are the things holding back the system.
The first is through collective bargaining, which takes place in local school districts. Through collective bargaining, the unions are able to win countless restrictive work rules written into binding contracts that specify how the schools must be organized. Typically, for example, these contracts include salary rules requiring that teachers be paid entirely on the basis of seniority and credentials, without any regard for whether their students are actually learning anything.
That may have something to do with seniority and credentials being among the fairest and most consistent means of arranging a pay scale. It's not uncommon in any contracted workforce for people with more training, higher credentials, and more experience to get paid more. Of course, if pay scale is to be tied to teacher performance, that performance needs to be tied exclusively to how well the teacher performs, not how well their students perform, which is something states tend to have difficulty understanding. You'll get to that part, though.
Often, these contracts also include seniority rules that allow senior teachers to take desirable jobs that come open, even if these teachers are mediocre in the classroom or a bad fit for the school. There are also seniority rules requiring that, in layoff situations, excellent young teachers must be let go automatically, and their senior colleagues must be kept on no matter how incompetent they may be. Reformers have tried to bring accountability to American education, but the unions have stood in the way. They've opposed using test scores to measure teacher performance. They've opposed performance-based pay. They've even opposed moving bad teachers out of the classroom. As a result, there are rarely any consequences for low performance. No one's pay suffers. No one loses a job.
Well, all three of those are currently tied to test scores in the United States, which has only increased its emphasis on standardized testing over the last 2 decades. Just because it's difficult to fire someone with a great deal of experience doesn't mean it's impossible. This is a straight-up myth. I've taught full-time in 2 different schools in 2 different states, and I've seen teachers and administrators everywhere from 1 year into their career to 1 year away from retirement get let go due to incompetence. The reality is that firing teachers in their first few years is easier, but even a lot of veteran teachers are only offered 1-year contracts. Next year will be 7.5 full years for me, and I just signed another 1-year contract like I always have. If they really want to get rid of me, all they have to do is not hire me back. No explanations needed. I've worked my contracted time. They're under no legal obligation to ask me back if I'm incompetent, and there's nothing in a teachers' union, even if I did belong to one, which I never have, can do about it.
Have also fiercely opposed the second major reform movement of our time, the movement for school choice, which seeks to give families new options, to empower them to leave bad schools, and to give the regular public schools stronger incentives to improve. Here, too, the unions fight for their members, not for students and their families. In this case, because school choice allows children, and thus money and jobs, to leave the schools where union members teach. Indeed, the unions are so opposed to choice that they fight to defeat it even for the poorest kids trapped in the nation's worst schools.
Now that's some infuriatingly disingenuously presented bullshit right there. He's talking about using government funds to send students from poor public schools to private schools, charter schools, magnet schools, etc., which is why he juxtaposed them with regular public schools. State funding for schools are based on student enrollment, which means every student who goes to a private school financially damages the public school, leaving even fewer resources for the public school students who remain there. He then has the gall to suggest that public schools need to have their funding cut in order to have the incentive to work harder. Of course, just because a student would choose a private school doesn't guarantee that the school would choose him or her. A private school is free to have entry standards to get in, just like colleges do, primarily using standardized tests to decide if a student is fit to enroll there in the first place. Meaning that the private schools would just keep getting more quality students in terms of test scores, while those who don't fit that bill remain in public schools. Well, the public schools are told that they're going to receive less and less funding unless they have enough incentive to finally just get better. Isn't it strange that privately funded schools, primarily attended by students coming from families who can afford to pay for their education and who may need to reach test performance standards, tend to outperform public schools who need to educate everyone when the primary basis for judgment is standardized test score performance? Of course, those test results are the primary reference point for every time he talks about a bad school or a bad teacher in this video. Every teacher evaluation form in every state has something to do with data-based measurable student scores, growth, etc. This standard, either officially or unofficially, uses standardized test scores of some variety whenever applicable for that measurable data. The state level pressures administrators to get good test scores and graduation rates because that's how schools are judged. If those administrators can't get that job done, the school board's job is to replace them with people who can. The pressure gets pushed to teachers whose jobs have become to crank out passing test scores from their students. It used to be their job to educate their students, but you know, this was the government's idea of adding accountability and rigor to the profession. So when you say that unions have opposed moving bad teachers out of the classroom, I need you to quantify that. What made them bad teachers? And are they protected because the big bad union wants bad teachers protected, or because they've had students struggle on tests and the government doesn't know how else to judge them? If a school's administration believes a teacher is doing poorly, it's the admin's job to put them on an improvement plan to help them get better. If they don't get better, the paperwork is on file that the admin did what they could, and they try to find someone who can do the job with more fidelity. Some bad teachers are kept around for various circumstances, like if it's just too difficult to find replacements in certain remote or extremely poor districts who can't offer a competitive enough teacher salary to attract a replacement in need. But then again, these are nuances of the issue that most teachers know all about, while most political science professors have no idea. I won't be seeking a degree from Prager U anytime soon.